Okay, now let's turn to argumentation, or the basics of argumentation. So philosophy involves many debates on different topics. So here's not a particularly philosophical topic, but consider the topic, do aliens exist? Well, one person might say yes. Here Bob says yes. Here Jane says no. And here Sam says, I don't have an opinion, or he just doesn't know, or something like that. So on this topic, we say that Bob and Jane each have a view, or we say that Bob and Jane each have a position. They have different positions on the matter, whereas Sam is neutral. He doesn't have an opinion. Sometimes we might also say that he's agnostic. And then with positions and views, there are also arguments. So Bob says, well, yes, aliens do exist. And here's his reason. There are so many planets in the universe. Aliens must exist. Jane says, they don't exist. Otherwise, we would have found them by now. So Bob and Jane are both giving arguments to defend their position. And arguments have a number of different parts to them. So let's look at those parts. So again, here's Bob's argument. There are so many planets in the universe. If there are so many planets in the universe, aliens must exist. Therefore, aliens must exist. So the first two numbered parts are called premises. We have premises 1 and 2. And then the third one is the conclusion. But apart from the premises and conclusion, there's also an inference or implication. We say that the premises imply the conclusion, or the premises do not imply the conclusion. Or we say that we can infer the conclusion from the premises, or we cannot infer the conclusion from the premises. So the point is that the premises are supposed to be a reason for the conclusion, so that if the premises are true, then that gives us good reason to believe the conclusion is true. So the inference is the movement from the premises to the conclusion. Notice that we cannot say things like the premises infer the conclusion, or the premises do not infer the conclusion. These are not things that you can say in English or philosophical English. They don't make sense, because inferences are things that we make. So we can infer the conclusion from the premises. But you don't say that the premises infer the conclusion. Rather, premises imply the conclusion. So these are things you can say, and these are things you cannot say. And after making arguments, there often come objections to arguments. So here are two ways to object to an argument. One way is to attack a premise. Another way is to attack an inference. So take, for example, this argument. Premise 1, I ate a lot of unhealthy food this morning. Conclusion, so I'm going to feel sick. Well, here's a premise, and we could attack this premise, right? We might go this strategy A and attack the premise. So we want to say, oh, this argument is a bad argument because the premise is false. And you might argue that the premise is false by saying, well, actually, that food was healthy. The food that you ate was healthy. You thought it wasn't healthy, but it's actually healthy. A different way to argue that this argument is bad is to attack the inference. So to attack the idea that the premise gives us good reason to believe the conclusion. And in this case, we can attack the inference by saying something like, you often eat a lot of unhealthy food in the morning without feeling sick. So this objection is basically saying, well, even if it's true that you ate a lot of unhealthy food this morning, let's assume that that's true. It still doesn't mean that you're going to feel sick today. After all, many times you have had unhealthy food in the morning, and you didn't feel sick. So that's a way of attacking the inference rather than the premise. Notice that even if an objection to an argument is good, that doesn't mean the conclusion is false. The conclusion could still be true. So take an example. Premise 1, pigs have wings. Conclusion, therefore, 2 plus 2 equals 4. So this is a bad argument. The premise is false. Pigs do not have wings. Nevertheless, the conclusion that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is still true. So this is an example of an argument that is bad because it has a false premise. You might also even attack the inference. But the conclusion is still true. Now let's talk about counter-arguments. So consider this argument. Premise 1, Ted is trustworthy. We can trust Ted. Premise 2, Ted says that eating ruganmian 3 times a day is healthy. Therefore, eating ruganmian 3 times a day is healthy. Now, there's our original argument. But suppose someone sees this argument and they think, well, I want to reply. Well, look, let's say, here's my thought. Premise 1, Susan is trustworthy. She's someone we can trust. Premise 2, Susan says eating ruganmian 3 times a day is not healthy. Therefore, eating ruganmian 3 times a day is not healthy. This argument here is a counter-argument. It's called a counter-argument to this argument. So it does not tell us what is wrong with the first argument, since it doesn't attack a premise, nor does it attack the inference to the conclusion. It just argues for the opposite position, right? It has a conclusion that is the opposite of this conclusion. This one says that it's healthy, and this one argues that it's not healthy. So it's just arguing, it's a counter-argument. It argues for the opposite position. So here's just a little bit of a summary of a few of the things we've just talked about. These are different ways to respond to a position. So we saw already that one way to respond to a position is to object to the argument for that position. And there's 2 ways to do that. You can either attack a premise of that argument, or you can attack an inference of that argument. But notice, you do not object to an argument by attacking the conclusion. You never say, oh, I think your argument is bad because the conclusion is false. No, that's a no-no. In philosophy, when you give an argument, the argument is your reason for the conclusion. So if you're going to object to the argument, you need to object to the reasoning, not to the conclusion that's made from that reasoning. So if you want to object to an argument, you must do one of these. You cannot just directly attack the conclusion. Or if you're asked to evaluate an argument, you must do one of these. Simply saying that the conclusion is false or giving an argument that the conclusion is false is not a way of evaluating an argument. You need to do one of these instead. But a different way to respond to a position is to give a counter-argument. This is essentially like attacking the conclusion. But you just never say that you're attacking a conclusion. Rather, you say you attack a position. So you can give an argument that attacks the position. So for example, we saw this argument before that says that Ted is trustworthy, and Ted says that eating rugan mian 3 times a day is healthy, therefore eating rugan mian 3 times a day is healthy. Well, what are some ways we can respond to this position that it's healthy? Well, we can attack this argument by either attacking a premise or inference. So you might object, say, well, Ted is not trustworthy. He believes anything he hears. So this would be an objection to the argument because you're attacking premise 1. Or you might give a counter-argument, like the counter-argument that we saw before, which is to say something like, Susan is trustworthy, and she says that eating it 3 times a day is not healthy. Therefore, it's not healthy. There are different strengths and weaknesses by going one of these routes. So if you go this route, if you object to the argument, a strength of that is that it helps to show why the argument for that position is bad. But a weakness of this route is that it doesn't directly argue that the position is wrong, right? You can have a bad argument for a conclusion while the conclusion is still true. Whereas if you decide to give a counter-argument, a strength of that route is that it directly argues that the position is right or wrong. But a weakness of that is that it doesn't help to show why the argument for the opposite side is a bad argument. So usually if you want a very thorough attack of a position, if you want to attack a position and respond to a position thoroughly, you will both object to the arguments for that position and give counter-arguments to that position. That way you're both showing that the arguments for that position are bad and showing that the position itself is false or wrong. Okay, now it's time to do an exercise, exercise 1.2. So consider the following argument. 1. Ben is the fastest runner. 2. Therefore, Ben can eat 4 bowls of rugan mian in 10 seconds. So this is what you're supposed to do, and do it in the corresponding order. A. Give a counter-argument. B. Object to a premise. C. Object to an inference. D. Object to the argument. And E. Explain what it means for someone to be neutral with respect to the conclusion of the argument. So respond, answer these questions now, and you can pause the video to give yourself some time. So we've seen different kinds of presentations of arguments. So there's informal and formal ones. So an informal argument would be something like, Bob says to Jane, we should watch The Lion King. There's nothing better for us to do. And then the formal presentation of that argument would be premise 1. There's nothing better for Bob and Jane to do than to watch The Lion King. And conclusion, therefore Bob and Jane should watch The Lion King. By the way, The Lion King is a movie. You've probably heard of it. So now we're going to see how we can change an informal argument into a formal one. So we're going to do it with this example. So Bob says, Donald Trump is the US president. We also know that he is a mortal. By mortal, I mean that he won't live forever. This is because he is a human, and all humans are mortal. So the question is, how do we change this informal presentation into a more formal one? And here I will give you some general rules how to start off such a formal presentation. So the rules would be, first, identify the premises and conclusion, then put the premises on the top and the conclusion on the bottom, number the premises and conclusion, use a word to indicate the conclusion, replace pronouns like it and him with names or descriptions. Each premise and conclusion should be a single sentence. And finally, separate single claims into separate premises when possible. So let's look at each of these with respect to the example that we just saw. So starting with A, identify the premises and conclusion. Sometimes there are premise and conclusion indicators. These are indicators that are present within the informal presentation. So for example, some premise indicators would be the words because, since, given that, for, on the grounds that, this follows from, and etc. There are other sorts of premise indicators, but this is a pretty good list for here. So when you see these words, you have a pretty good sense that the claim that follows after it is a premise. And then some conclusion indicators would be therefore, thus, hence, so, consequently, this shows that, etc., etc. So let's look at the example that we were looking at before. So here again we have this claim. Let's see, are there any premise or conclusion indicators here? Well, let's check. Bob says Donald Trump is the US president. We also know that he is a mortal. By mortal, I mean that he won't live forever. This is because, well, here we definitely have a premise indicator. This is because he is a human and all humans are mortal. So this is indicating that what comes afterwards is a premise. So we can say, oh, okay, here's one of our premises. But if this is the premise, or one of them at least, what is the conclusion? Well, this is the conclusion. He is a mortal. So we have this as a premise and this as a conclusion. What about the rest of the quote? Or any of these premises, conclusions? We don't have any other premise indicators or conclusion indicators. So we just need to look at these sentences by themselves to see if they actually are premises. And this first sentence, Donald Trump is the US president, well, this isn't really being used as an argument or as part of the reason for establishing this conclusion. So this isn't really a premise. If anything, it's more of the setup of the argument to explain who Donald Trump is and who we're talking about. But what about this sentence? By mortal, I mean that he won't live forever. So this isn't really a premise either. It's more just an explanation of what the terms mean within the conclusion and within the premises. So here, I think we've correctly identified where the premise and the conclusion are. So the next rule then would be to put the premises on the top and the conclusion on the bottom. So that's pretty simple. We'll put this sentence right here, and then we'll put this thing, that's conclusion, at the bottom. Pretty straightforward. Okay, there's the argument again that we have so far. The third rule, C, says number the premises and conclusion. So there's a number of different ways you can number premises and conclusion, and they're especially useful to use different ways or different numbers when you're dealing with many different arguments. But here are some ways. You might say use A or B, so you use A and B to number these things. You could use a period after each letter. You could use Roman numerals, I, and use a period. You could use lowercase letters, A, B. You could use a period there too. Or here I'm giving an example where you're using a bracket instead. You can always just use a bracket, or you could just use a period, or you can use double brackets where you have a bracket on either side of the letter. Here I just have a single bracket. Or you can put 1 or 2, which I've been using. Another way you can go is also have 1 and C here. So C, if you really want to make the conclusion stand out, you can put a C to stand for conclusion. So it really helps indicate that the conclusion is there. So you can use all sorts of ways of numbering your premises, but here I'm just going to stick with this one. Okay. Now the next rule is D, use a word to indicate the conclusion. Okay, so here's my conclusion. You can use words such as therefore, hence, thus, or sometimes you'll see this triple dot, 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 dot. This also means therefore. It means the same thing as these. So you can put any of those in your conclusion to indicate that this is the conclusion, and I'm going to just put therefore. So therefore he is mortal. The next rule is replace pronouns like it and him with names or descriptions. So in this argument we do have some pronouns. Here's a pronoun, he, and here's the pronoun again. Now pronouns are not very good because it's ambiguous, it's vague. It's hard to tell what the pronoun is referring to. If you just see this argument right here, you won't know what he is referring to. That just could be any sort of man out there or person that's a male. So it's better to replace that with the actual person we're talking about. So in this case, Donald Trump. So let's put the name Donald Trump in both of these cases so that it's clear not only that this premise is talking about Donald Trump, but also that the conclusion is talking about Donald Trump. So here we go. Donald Trump. So now it says Donald Trump is a human and all humans are mortal, therefore Donald Trump is immortal. The next rule, each premise and conclusion should be a single sentence. This argument example follows that. Both of the steps, both the premise and the conclusion, are a single sentence, so that's not a problem here. This would be a problem if we had written down this argument differently. So one thing you might have done was write down the argument like this. You might have said, okay, this is the premise, Donald Trump is a human, and all humans are mortal. But you might have wanted to use this line that says, by mortal, I mean that he won't live forever, and you might have wanted to put this in your argument somewhere. So you might have put it in the premise, or maybe you put it in the conclusion, so you might have said, therefore Donald Trump is immortal, that is, Trump won't live forever, where you're taking this part from here, that he won't live forever. So you might feel that you need to include this explanation in the argument, since it was in the informal presentation. But this rule is saying that's not a good idea. Don't include that sort of thing here. A better strategy, okay, so don't do that, okay? You should have each line, each premise, each conclusion, just include a single thought, and don't try and include another sentence to explain that line. So a better thing to do is to include a setup before the argument. So in this case, you could have said something like this. In the following argument, Bob takes Donald Trump is mortal, essentially to mean that Trump won't live forever. So you're explaining things beforehand, what you're going to mean in the premises and conclusion beforehand, and then you present the argument. So here's the argument without this extra sentence over here. Of course, there's different ways to word this sort of setup. This is one example of how you might do it. So a setup is good. Another way to word a setup could be something like this. Bob takes mortal beings to be beings that won't live forever. Bob's argument that Trump is mortal is as follows. And then, again, you have the argument down there. So that's a way to avoid making your premises or conclusions too cluttered or have too many sentences in them, and make it more simplified and straightforward. So the last general rule is this: separate single claims into separate premises when possible. So in this case, down here, it is possible to separate premises. So my premise, Donald Trump is a human and all humans are mortal, this can be separated, especially since there's this and, indicating that it's basically just joining two claims. One claim is Donald Trump is human, second claim is all humans are mortal. We can separate these into two premises. So here we have the exact same setup, but what I'm going to do is just split premise 1 into two different premises. So just Donald Trump is a human, take the first part of this premise, and then take the second part of the premise and put it there. So Donald Trump is a human, all humans are mortal, therefore Donald Trump is immortal. So we're separating the premises when possible. And here it is possible. But here's a warning. Not all claims with an and should be separated. The last claim that we saw had the and it was good to separate those. But here's a claim that is not good to be separated. So take this argument, for example. Premise 1, if Bob graduated from a good university and Bob had good grades, then Bob will get a good job. Premise 2, Bob graduated from a good university. Premise 3, Bob had good grades. Conclusion, therefore Bob will get a good job. Now, this and doesn't indicate that this premise should be separated into two premises. If you did separate it, you would get something like this. Premise 1, if Bob graduated from a good university, then Bob will get a good job. Premise 2, if Bob had good grades, then Bob will get a good job. And then copying the other two premises, Bob graduated from a good university, Bob had good grades, conclusion, therefore Bob will get a good job. So these two premises, if you're trying to use these as splitting up this premise, it doesn't really work, because these two premises don't really capture the meaning of the original one. This premise is saying that you need two things in order to ensure that Bob will get a good job. It's saying that these two things, if you have these two things, that suffices for Bob to get a good job. But these premises are saying something very different. This one's saying this is enough to get a good job. You don't need good grades. And this one's saying, and having good grades is enough. You don't need to graduate from a good university. Whereas this premise is just saying that, well, if you do have both, then you'll get a good job, which is not the same meaning as these two. So, and just because you see and doesn't mean that it can be separated. You need to think hard about what the premise is actually saying, and whether it does allow you to separate them. So don't do that. So, as we saw, we originally started with this informal presentation of an argument, and we, by using those rules, got to this sort of formal presentation of an argument. Of course, using those rules won't always be enough to get you a formal presentation, an accurate one, but they're a pretty good guideline. So they're a good starting place to build up a good formal presentation of an argument. So let's practice using those general guidelines. So here's exercise 1.3. So following the general rules, give a formal presentation of the following. Shunzi says, human nature is not good, for human nature consists of those human traits that are spontaneous. Those things cannot be learned. Yet goodness isn't a spontaneous human trait. Okay, so pause the video here and use the rules that we saw to try and formulate this argument to make it more formal, a more formal presentation. And then when you're done, you can keep playing the video. So now we're going to look at how you might make arguments clearer. We're going to look at 3 different methods. And one method is to use subconclusions. This method is especially useful when you have an argument with many premises, which might make it hard to understand the inference or the implication of the argument. So take a simple example of this. Premise 1, Bob is sick. Premise 2, sick people should take medicine. Premise 3, people who should take medicine should get medicine from the pharmacy. Conclusion, therefore Bob should get medicine from the pharmacy. So this argument has 3 premises and 1 conclusion. The more premises you have, if you just have a single conclusion, then you're saying that all the premises are needed to get to the conclusion. But it might be hard for the reader to see whether the conclusion actually does follow from, or whether you can infer the conclusion from the premises, because there's just so many premises to think about. This case might not be so difficult, but the more premises that you have, the more difficult it will be to see if you can infer the conclusion from the premises. And if it's hard for the reader to see that, then it will be hard to convince the reader that you have a good argument, because they'll just have trouble understanding the argument. So to sort of address this sort of issue, we can add a subconclusion like this. So we'll keep premise 1, Bob is sick. We'll keep premise 2, sick people should take medicine. But now we'll introduce this, therefore Bob should take medicine. And this is a subconclusion. So we're basically saying this is something that you can infer from these 2 premises. You can infer that from these 2 that Bob should take medicine. And then you can go on, take your 3rd premise, put it here, and then put the conclusion down here. So here, so this final conclusion, we normally just call the conclusion, but once you start including subconclusions, we tend to call this sort of conclusion the main conclusion to distinguish it from subconclusions. So where this is just a conclusion, you could also call this a main conclusion, but you don't really need to since there are no subconclusions. In this argument, since there's a subconclusion, it's good to say that this is the main conclusion. So this subconclusion is useful because it makes it easier to see whether these premises do imply this conclusion. And so here you see that I put a note. It says from 1 and 2. This means I'm intending this conclusion to be inferred from these premises. You can infer this conclusion from these premises. So with this argument, you don't need to look at 3 premises and see if they imply a conclusion. Here I'm just going to look at 2 premises and see if they imply this conclusion. And here it's pretty easy to see, yeah, okay, Bob is sick. Sick people should take medicine. Therefore, Bob should take medicine. Yeah, that's pretty easy to see that, yeah, we can infer this conclusion from these premises. And then the same thing for this main conclusion. Here I have this note. It's from C1 and 3. So that means I'm only intending for you to look at these 2. And just by looking at these 2, you can see that you can infer this conclusion. And so I can ignore these 2, and I'll just look at these 2. Bob should take medicine. People who should take medicine should get medicine from the pharmacy. And yeah, here it's pretty easy to see that those 2 do imply that Bob should get medicine from the pharmacy. So again, instead of looking at 3 premises and seeing if I can infer the conclusion from those 3, I can just look at 2 premises at a time and see if I can infer a conclusion. Then I look at another 2 and then see if I can infer this conclusion. So that makes it much easier for the reader to see whether the inferences, the implications, are good ones. Notice I've also changed these numberings. So here I had 4 as the conclusion. I've instead numbered it as C2 and made the subconclusion C1. This is just to make it clearer that these are conclusions, and that this is the first conclusion and this is the second one. You could keep them as numbers. You could say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but here I just prefer to use 1, 2, C1, 3, C2. It's up to you. Okay, let's look at another way to make arguments clearer, and this is by reducing premises. So we've already looked at one way to make them clear, that's subconclusions. This is another way, reducing premises. So let's take the argument we just were looking at, which included this subconclusion, and we can reduce the premises. So right now we have 3 main premises, 1, 2, 3, a subconclusion, and 1 conclusion. Now we just want to reduce the amount of lines we have. We can do that by taking these 3, making this one our first premise, this one our second premise, and this one our conclusion. And then we take these 2 premises and then put them after the formal presentation of the argument and put it in a premise defense section. So we add another section here. And then in this section, instead of using numbers and such, we just use normal sentences. And we can say something like, the reason 1 is true is that Bob is sick and sick people should take medicine. So I'm just taking Bob is sick people should take medicine, and putting it here. Bob is sick and sick people should take medicine. So then this premise defense section is no longer part of the formal presentation. Rather, it becomes just explanations after. And in this section, I'm explaining why you should believe the premises of the argument. So these are 2 different ways you can present the argument. You can present it this longer way with a subconclusion, or you can present it this shorter way and then have a section afterwards that explains things. It all depends what you want to emphasize. Do you want to really emphasize that these 2 premises are premises, things that you really need to think about in the argument? Or are they simple enough, something the reader doesn't need to think about too much, so you can just stick it at the end and make them not have to think about it while they're going through this part of the argument? So where we originally saw that the argument had 3 premises and a conclusion, we were able to reduce it to 2 premises and a conclusion just by adding this last section here. But we couldn't simply just delete one of these premises. Instead, we had to first get a subconclusion, and then we could delete 2 premises to get to it. Okay, let's do an exercise. In this exercise, you'll consider the following quote. David Lewis says, "Suppose that Tim learns that his grandfather had done something terrible in the 1920s, several years before the birth of Tim's mother. Suppose also that Tim has invented a time machine. While it may seem that Tim could go back in time and kill his grandfather before the birth of Tim's mother to prevent him from doing this terrible thing, in fact, it is impossible. The past has already happened, and anything that has already happened cannot be changed. Thus, the past cannot be changed. And since Tim did not kill his grandfather before the birth of Tim's mother, he cannot change that fact." So, do the following. First, give a formal presentation of David Lewis's argument using a subconclusion, and then give a formal presentation of it by using the strategy of reducing premises. This will require you to have a defense of the premises section. The last way we'll look at making arguments clearer is to use consistent terms. So we've looked at adding subconclusions, we've looked at reducing premises. Now we'll look at using consistent terms. So consider this argument. Premise 1, it's wrong to promote the killing of sentient life. Premise 2, eating meat encourages murdering conscious beings. Conclusion, therefore it's immoral to consume chicken. So this argument might be a bit difficult to understand because there's so many different words being used. Each line uses different words from all the other lines. But we can see that the person who's making this argument is trying to use words to mean the same thing, essentially, in different places. They're using synonyms. So, for example, here we have this phrase, sentient life. But we also have this phrase, conscious beings. It seems that these two phrases are being used to mean the same thing. And then over here, promote the killing. They're also using a very similar phrase here, encourages murdering. So maybe they mean the same thing, or the author intended to mean the same thing by those two. We also have it's wrong and it's immoral. So those might mean the same thing too. We also have eating meat and consuming chicken. Okay, these two aren't the same thing. But this is a specific way of doing this. There's different ways to eat meat. You could eat chicken. You could also eat beef. You could eat pork. You could eat sheep, right? So here, this is a more specific example of eating meat. But these are very similar ideas with respect to this argument. So we could try and make this argument clearer by not using so many different words or ideas. So here's one way to do it. So in this argument, it's wrong to promote the killing of sentient life. Eating meat promotes the killing of sentient life. Therefore, it's wrong to eat meat. So here, I have consistent terms. I've used promote the killing in both of the premises. I'm not using the words encourage murdering. Likewise, I'm using sentient life in both the premises. I'm using wrong in this premise and this conclusion. And here I've decided to just use the phrase eating meat instead of talking about consuming chicken. So this is one way to make the terms more consistent. Of course, you could do it many other ways. Here's one other way you could have made them consistent. Here I've used the terms encourage murdering in both premises instead of using promote the killing. Here I've used conscious beings in both instead of using sentient life. Immoral in both instead of wrong in both. Or eating chicken in both rather than talking about eating meat. So these are two different ways you can make this more consistent. So if I was to ask you to make this argument consistent, this would be a good answer. Or you could give this as an answer. You wouldn't need to give two answers. You shouldn't give two answers, just give one. And that's all you would need. Because here we're going to do another exercise. Okay, time for another exercise. Change the following arguments so that their terms are consistent. First argument, premise 1. A happy life requires that you have friends. Having comrades requires you to be kind to others. So, a fulfilled life requires that you treat others well. Second argument. The first premise says there are billions of planets in the universe. Premise 2. If there is an enormous number of galaxies with planets, then the probability that there are advanced life forms on other planets is very high. Conclusion, therefore, it's very likely that there is intelligent alien life.